Hi, this is Debbie, and today I'm going to continue my review of the Winsor & Newton pigment markers. I'm going to call today part 2, and in the top corner I'm going to leave a link to part 1, where I initially looked at the markers and how they compared in size and properties to a Copic marker. And I also looked then at using these markers on a variety of different papers and card. To summarise that review, the markers work particularly well on Basel 40-pound vellum and Winsor & Newton marker paper, which is the paper that Winsor & Newton recommend for these markers. I didn't particularly find that they worked well on Nina Solar White or Copic Express It or Simon Says Stamp White. On black cardstock, the white blender had less opacity than the Uni Signo white gel pen. However, by colouring a white block, you were able then to use your coloured markers over the top. To conclude, the Winsor & Newton pigment markers worked best on the Basel 40-pound vellum and the Winsor & Newton pigment marker paper. I now want to take this review one step further and look at what other cards and marker papers these pigment markers from Winsor & Newton work on. So I got my hands on a couple of other marker pads, and also based on comments left on the previous review, I also got hold of some Yupo paper and some Ranger Speciality stamping paper. Please excuse my pronunciation because I really haven't got a clue how to pronounce this, but I had some Bienfang Graphics 360 marker paper pad, also a marker paper pad from Canson, the Ranger Speciality stamping paper which I mentioned, the Yupo paper, and also I've got a piece of watercolour card, and I'll come back to that later. Based on my experience from the first review, I know what I'm looking for in the way that these markers will work on a paper. I'm looking for that ability of the white blender to move the colour. So I'm using the Carmine marker and the white blender, and this is on the Bienfang Graphics 360 marker paper pad. That's quite a lightweight paper at 13.5 pounds, and yes, there's not really an awful lot of movement there. The white blender does lighten the colour of the carmine, but there's really not any movement. And when you apply the marker and then try and move it with your finger, this was something that I found in the first review was indicative of the ability of the marker to move on the paper. There wasn't really any movement at all. I'm going to fast forward through the Canson marker paper pad, as I found the same results as the Bienfang one, in that there wasn't really any movement at all on these marker pads. I did, however, have high hopes for the Yupo paper and the Ranger Speciality stamping paper. These have a slick surface, and I was hoping that the markers would actually move on these papers, and indeed they did. This is the Yupo paper, which is 110 GSM. It's slightly thicker than the marker paper, but is still very much a paper rather than a cardstock. And here you can see that the lightest touch of the white blender to the carmine, and you can get a real range of pinks as it fades out from the dark pink right down to the light pink. Equally, the marker stays wet long enough on the Yupo paper that you can move it with your finger. I've speeded up the Ranger Speciality stamping paper as I found the results very similar to the Yupo paper. So yes, brilliant movement of the marker with the white blender, and equally the ability to move the marker while it's still wet with your finger. Now, before I complete part 2 of this review, I wanted just to throw a wild card out there. This is using the markers on watercolour card. By now I'd got to know the properties of the pigment markers slightly, and I wasn't expecting these markers to move at all on the watercolour card, and indeed they didn't. They didn't move with the white blender or equally by moving with your finger. However, as these markers give quite paint-like results, I wondered how they would work using them more like a traditional paint. So I added some water to the watercolour card and then scribbled the marker onto an acrylic block. I then picked up the marker colour with the paintbrush, and it actually works just like a watercolour. You can dab it into the wet water on your card and it moves and blends like a watercolour would. Equally, you can pick up the marker with a wet paintbrush and apply it directly to the watercolour card. When adding water, that does move the marker and blend it out, so it is behaving much more like a paint once it's applied with water. To summarise my findings of the Winsor & Newton pigment markers from both part 1 and part 2 of my review, I didn't find that the pigment markers worked very well on Nina Solar White, Copic Express It or Simon Says Stamp White, or equally on the Canson and Bienfang marker pads. However, there were some really interesting results on other card and papers. So on black cardstock, the white blender allows you to use your coloured markers over the top. And then on Winsor & Newton pigment marker paper, Basil £40 vellum, Ranger's Speciality stamping paper and Yupo paper, you get really interesting results of the markers blending, moving on the slick surface of the papers. I particularly like the results of the markers on the Basil £40 vellum and the Ranger's Speciality stamping paper. I love the chalkiness of the appearance of the marker on the vellum in particular. And also these two are more cardstock in weight. These two papers are more cardstock in weight and therefore for me will be more useful for card making. And then the wild card, the watercolour card. Obviously the markers didn't work on the watercolour card, however the markers do have interesting properties in that you can use them with water in a watercolour-like way. I hope you found these reviews of the Winsor & Newton pigment markers useful, how the pigment markers will work well on some cards and papers and not on others. The takeaway from this is probably to look for papers and cardstocks which have a slick surface, a non-porous one. I took my findings forward and created this card using the markers on vellum. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to create a video at the time. However, I'll leave a link above to the blog post where there are some more photographs. I'll be back with part 3 of this review where I'll be using the markers on a project and hope to bring you that video shortly. In the meantime, I'll leave links to the markers down below in the YouTube description and also to the blog posts that I mentioned. I hope you consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and thank you for joining me today.